friends. So you're probably wondering why you're here, or more importantly, why I am here. So I guess we're just going to get down to brass tacks, and I'll let you know a little bit about me and how this whole thing came about. And it really began when Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016. Because when that happened, a door was open for a new way to think about the music lyrics of contemporary musicians. What must first be noted is that Dylan won this award, not for those moments in his lyrics where he, merely alludes to Shakespeare, Kerouac, or Arthur Rimbaud. No, there's clearly something worthy of merit in the lyrics of Dylan that warrant and has for years, scrutinous linguistic analysis. The same type of analysis that typically is afforded to the likes of T.S. Eliot, Toni Morrison, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Indeed, Christopher Ricks's book, Dylan's Visions of Sin, was a fairly prescient work in 2004, ushering in a new way to view Dylan's linguistic complexity while also questioning the categories of language that we would typically equate to the quote-unquote literary. Now, I'm clearly borrowing from Ricks in this project, though my analysis is going to utilize, well, let's just say, a different means of execution. Ricks is certainly an academic, and his work on Dylan is an academic read. But being the first of its kind, it generated interest well beyond the academic sphere, mainly owing to its subject matter. It's frickin' Bob Dylan. For my project, I'm going to put a little twist on the traditional academic read. Yes, first, I am a tenured college professor. Yes, my focus is on British literature, specifically poetry. Beyond college football, my first love has always been music. And even though I consider myself a fairly shitty guitar player who's never really been in a band, it's not that I haven't really been in a band. I've never been in a band. It was inevitable that in dealing with language as my profession, at some point, I would find my way to focusing on music lyrics. So this must have been late 2010, early 2011, when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Fordham University. And the chair of our English department at the time, Maria Farland, she came up to me and she asked if I could put together a class that was a little sexier than the typical basic, English, not basic, but, the typical English course, and, something that kind of spark interest in our students. And that's when I first created Rock, Rap, and the Poetic Tradition. That's the title of the course, which I first taught in the early winter of 2011 at Fordham University. And it was a popular class, and it garnered attention. And, WFUV, the fairly awesome indie college radio station at Fordham, they have so much cool stuff there. They were interested in it, and they ran a podcast with me. And it was kind of popular. I got a lot of cool responses from it. It made me feel good. I actually think it was that podcast, maybe the class itself, that actually got me my future job at Louisiana Tech University. Not my fairly mediocre publication in some sort of marginal French journal on English language poets. No, I think it was that podcast. All right, there was something sexy and attractive about that podcast, and I actually do think it was probably that podcast that got me my job. I'm not sure. Maybe the class also. Both of them had some sort of appeal. And I got my job at from Fordham University, where I did my PhD. I got my job at Louisiana Tech University in Ruston, Louisiana, and I brought that class from Fordham to Louisiana Tech. And I've been teaching it on and off again for, well over a decade. And as one of my colleagues, said to me after sitting in on my class right after the pandemic, or it was actually right before the pandemic, I'm sorry. He said to me, dude, if you could bottle that class, it'd make for a great book. This was well before public interest in the word poetry in conjunction with contemporary music lyrics beyond Dylan started to really swell. finally exploding with one particular artist in the spring of 2024. No names mentioned. You know what I'm talking about. When she kind of referred to herself as a poet titularly through the release of her 11th studio album, not counting, re-recordings and live album releases. Kind of referred to herself. She was really actually referring to that dude. I don't know which dude it was. Was it the dude in England? The dude from the 1975? I'm not sure. But anyway, yeah. You know what I'm talking about. It's the future Mrs. Kelsey. Though, actually, it's probably more apropos to consider him the future Mrs. Swift. Anyway, the question of poetry within contemporary music lyrics, is a palatable topic in our collective cultural consciousness. But this question is not a fad, and it's not going away anytime soon. Not to pat myself on the back, but I've been having this discussion for years. I'm sure that I'm one of just many professors around the world who have been addressing, poetry and music lyrics, for a long time. Yet I decided to put pen to paper eventually. And when I did so, I immediately attracted, big name academic publishers, who were excited by my ideas, and then read my work. And something changed, maybe because of the way I went about it. Yeah, I attracted one really big name publisher in London. And the commissioning editor, she was really excited about it and loved the ideas. And then she sent it to the readers who review this type of stuff. And I remember the response in the email when she rejected me. She said, "My language made one of her readers bristle." Literally, I love it. It's so British. Made him bristle. All right. But, still other readers, who weren't, turned off so much by my language because I tried to write, not necessarily my academic voice, more on this to come, but my classroom voice, as well as a little more anecdotal as well. This turned off certain readers. Other readers were cool with it. And, but the academic press, they consistently told me that this was meant for a trade book, not an academic press. All right. And trade books, Barnes and Noble, stuff you'd find in actual bookstores, and so that's when I pivoted, and I went to the trade books, and I went to the indie presses, and I went to literary agents, and again, I garnered attention. People are interested in this idea. And then they read my text. Even some serious big name literary agencies were very interested. And their response was, fittingly enough, my manuscript was fit for the academic realm. So here I am between these two ends of the spectrum, stuck in fucking limbo. And I finally came to the realization that the answer to this kind of purgatory that I was stuck in was obvious. It's the internet. Which is where I'm now taking my classroom discussions, and I'm bringing them to you, the general public. Not necessarily with the aim to answer the question of whether or not, Tay-Tay is a poet. On a side note, you're not a poet just because you call yourself a poet, though she still may well be a poet. And maybe at some point, I'll attempt to answer this question. So, my buddy Rob Harvilla, of 60 Songs That Explain the 90s fame, told me that he would have loved to have taken a class such as this one when he was in college. So I guess that's exactly what I'm doing. You all get the opportunity to sit in on this class. And you also get a little bit of extra, all right? So get to the point, Levin, all right? What exactly is all this about? Okay, to clarify, similar to Christopher Ricks, this project is not about locating literary illusion, capital A illusion, i.e. referencing Romeo and Juliet in a music lyric. All right, don't get all pissed off, Swifties. I could very easily be referencing Dire Straits, who have a song called Romeo and Juliet, or innumerable other bands, who refer to Romeo and Juliet in one way or the other. It's not always about you or Tay-Tay. Not always. No. So, in my class and in this project, we're going to be looking at, long-standing poetic motifs, as a critical lens to unpack certain music lyrics, to see just how they may be considered poetic, or maybe even better, to use poetry as a lens for interpretation. Now, this is not about a simple comparison between poetry and music lyrics. So, just briefly about that word poetry. It's a word that's thrown around, fairly loosely, but it's way more complex than you may think. As you'll see, there's a lot that goes into this word. Thinkers, writers, scholars, philosophers have been debating its definition for over 2,000 years. And that is going to be part of this discussion. As the pandemic passed and I began this work, at first taking my classroom lectures and pretty much just kind of refiguring them into prose, a curious thing occurred, during the early stages of my writing process. I found myself no longer writing a mere academic text. And this was why those people from that London press were maybe a little turned off. Yeah. And I think that's also what's led me to this strange world of the internet. The more time I put into this work, the more I looked at the reality of our present day and age. And the more that I realized that this type of discussion is not just suited for the ivory tower, nor academic conferences, nor indie coffee shops, nor chat rooms, nor celebrity blogs, nor pop culture websites. No, the question of looking earnestly at music lyrics through the poetic tradition led to some surprising conclusions concerning our culture as a whole. And I discovered that my own personal experiences really helped accentuate this analysis. Shite. All right, now this is a problem if you're an academic. We're just supposed to analyze, interpret, think critically, but the academics, we're not necessarily supposed to be involved in the discussion. I mean, seriously, for those of you who have ever read an academic text, you know what I'm talking about. There's really no such thing as a distinct academic voice, or at least there is rarely an academic voice. Now, listen, I'm going to come back to this topic, but let's get to the subject of just what the F we are going to be going over the next so many weeks or so, all right? So like I said, my project is an analysis of music lyrics through the lens of poetry. But why even have this conversation? What can we learn by doing so? These are questions that I will get to. Through this journey, we're going to cover a variety of topics. All right, so I'm going to offer you a little teaser right now. All right, we're going to look at Lord Byron, the 19th century British Romantic poet, along with Kurt Cobain from Nirvana. In terms of how artists address fame within their works. We're going to look at avant-garde lyricism of modernist, imagist poetry from the early 20th century. Through the tension between indie or hipster music, such as Radiohead, all right, and a more traditional band such as Pearl Jam. We're going to look at marginal voices reversing long-standing expectations of women and African Americans. Through the poetry of little-known Romantic era poet Letitia Elizabeth Landon, and then the third wave feminist movement to the likes of Alanis Morissette and Liz Phair from the 90s, along with the poetry of Langston Hughes and the lyricism of NWA. All of this in the discussion of vulgarity and who's allowed to use vulgarity. Ooh, fun. Poetry is going to help. We're going to look at, a tension, what I like to call romantic tension, between the quote unquote blissful ignorance and the baggage that comes with knowledge through the Grateful Dead Standing on the Moon. We're going to look at the seemingly mundane and humorous lyricism of Wet Leg. I love him so much. Coupled with, the sardonic poetry of Philip Larkin. To see maybe how sometimes the mundane and the seemingly everyday is anything but. Finally, we're going to look at the immaterial aspect of art, that stuff that we really can't quite wrap our heads around. All right, and we're going to look at this through the lens of Percy Shelley, along with I have to do some Dylan. So we're going to get into Bob Dylan's cryptic "I'm Not There." And all of this results, in a surprising political turn. And there will be, many more tangential discussions, that address, I don't know, Miley, Britney, Kendrick, Van Halen, I don't know, Jimmy Buffett, Jack White, obviously Taylor. There will be so much more. And in the end, each discussion really does lead to larger cultural implications. So now that we have a little understanding of what we're getting into, let's talk a little more about it. Okay, so the logic behind my choices in both the course I teach and what I have written. So the logic here, these choices are not merely capricious on my part. Everything in here I've discovered through my studies, my work in the classroom, my discussions with my students, and my experiences outside of the classroom. But this isn't just about me. If that were the case, we'd be dealing with just, maybe a handful of bands from Seattle from 1991 to 1996. Listen, after the first couple talks, you may think that this is where we're going, but I promise you, be patient. There's more. I do play into my strengths, what I know best, but I also venture out into subject matters that are lesser known to me, or at least not quite as canonical. For the most part, I tend to steer away from, I guess you would say, the obvious choices that it comes to musicians. The low-hanging fruit in terms of artists that we would expect to connect to the literary tradition. The Beatles, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, Rush, Tom Waits, Neil Young, folk music in general. The Dylan song is an outlier, even for Dylan, as it does not contain certified lyrics. And it's Bob Dylan, so good luck trying to decipher them. All right. Nevertheless, this discussion that we're going to be having, really aims to display how characteristics of the literary tradition can be found in places and words that aren't quite so obvious. And by reading these lyrics through poetry, we come to understand how these texts signify larger issues that surround us on a daily basis. Possibly just as important to me is that this project captures my voice, if you haven't already noticed. Not my academic voice, which isn't exciting by any means. I kind of already mentioned this. But the voice that I bring into the classroom, and maybe even a more colloquial voice, since we're now on the internet, I can pretty much say whatever I want. I easily could have just turned this into a strictly academic project that would be read by 40 English professors. This is not a slight to my colleagues or other people as well, but we know who reads our work. But I wanted and still want, this project to appeal beyond the academic arena as I blend music lyrics with pop culture and classical literature, all distilled through personal experience. If you're watching or listening to this, you should be a lover of music, a lover of literature, a lover of pop culture, or someone with intellectual curiosity. But please, you have to have a sense of humor. Getting back to that reader in London, that dude had no sense of humor. No sense of humor. Fuck that dude. Rude to me. All right, moving on. So anyway, I put a disclaimer on all of my syllabi. Here's my disclaimer. This will cover mature subject matter. It may challenge some of your foundational beliefs. If you're not interested in an open discourse or are offended by challenging, sometimes uncomfortable subject matter, take another course, or in this case, stop listening. Also, I tend to utilize expletives, if you haven't already noticed. Always for rhetorical and logical linguistic purposes, or sometimes just for shits and giggles. See what I just did there? All right, so you've been warned. Now, Hunter S. Thompson was a pioneer of taking bland professional writing and interjecting his personality into the story, to make it for a more entertaining but not less important style of writing. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to do this while on LSD, though I may every once in a while have a drink every now and again to help with the discussion. It's water. That's a total lie. It's not water. But needless to say, what Hunter achieved, has been echoed over the years by Tom Wolfe, from writers like Tom Wolfe. It's more recently in the early 2000s, with Bill Simmons in the arena of sports, along with, someone like Chuck Klosterman and, just about anything and everything. Now, I'm not putting myself on these individuals' level. However, I'm taking a cue from them. Rarely do we see the critic or the scholar, at least the academic critic, with an actual voice. My project challenges this tradition. Many academics tend to be intimidating, owing mostly to a superfluous amount of jargon that is, the foundation of their thought and their writing. And that's why I think for the most part, academic texts are just read by academics. At the same time, academics can be kind of awkward. Not all of them, but a fair amount of them. It can be a little bit of a turnoff. But anyway, the general public is seemingly afraid or turned off by academics, but they don't always need to be. The problematic perception of the ivory tower is a subject that I will touch on from time to time throughout this process, especially in recent years, and the perception of academics and academic thought concerning real world matters. I will come back to this. Nevertheless, in getting back to the subject matter at hand, considering we are dealing with songs, this is going to be a different reading experience for many of you. I know you're going to be tempted to listen to the music behind the lyrics I'm discussing, and I certainly encourage you to do so. There will be moments in here when I instruct you to listen to the songs or snippets of the songs that I'm covering. So please, have your listening devices handy, along with your favorite streaming services. No shameless promotion on my part, at least not yet. So pick what works for you. I guess this is on YouTube, so YouTube will be fine. But in terms of poetry and the lyrics themselves, there will be moments when I provide excerpts from the works that I am focusing on. There will be other times when I will leave it up to you to find the lyrics and the poetry if you need or want more than what I provide. If it was up to me, I'd provide you with the entire music lyric and the entire poem or whatever text we're looking at. However, there are certain copyright laws out there that inhibit my ability to do so. Now, with the poetry, this is an easy search on the internet for you non-English majors out there without all the books that you didn't sell back when you were in college, or, well, you're still in college and haven't sold back yet. Easy search. Project Guten, blah, 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 blah. With the music lyrics, well, many of the artists, that I'm referencing in here, they have official band websites, where they provide their official lyrics. Doing a blind search on the internet can be dangerous, so tread carefully, my friends. Some music sites are just awful, really awful. I mean, really awful. Some are halfway decent. What's that one? A to something else in the alphabet lyrics. That one's pretty good. I like that one. They tend to be pretty spot on. But I love that certain streaming services provide lyrics on their app these days, but they're not always accurate. And a side note, I think that's also why this is such an intriguing project at the time, because I think the younger generation now are spending a lot more time actually looking at the lyrics while they're listening to the music because it's on their freaking phone. But anyway, again, they're not always accurate. So again, I'm going to ask for a little bit of due diligence on your part. I promise this will be a fun experience, but I do require a little bit of work. I mean, all you need for this type of work is a phone or any smart device, so don't get scared. I know you're listening to this on probably a smart device or your phone or your computer, but I'm guessing or hoping that you know how to open more than one tab at a time, and press pause, look something up, come back to me, whatever. It's not like I'm making you go to the library. Yes, this is my classroom voice, so get used to it. So let me get back to my voice for just one more moment. When I was in college and graduate school, my friends and I looked up to our professors, as if they were otherworldly. Especially when I was an undergrad at Boston University. Seeing my professors out at a coffee shop or drinking a beer at a restaurant was one of the coolest things ever. These were individuals who dedicated their lives to thought, serious, diligent thought. And in my mind, they were otherworldly, much more impressive than any of my parents' friends who ran multi-million-dollar companies or were jet-setting to their winter homes in Aspen or the Bahamas. However, the longer I was in college, the more I came to understand that these people who dedicated their lives to the mind were still just, people. They were like the rest of us. As Langston Hughes so nicely put it, who like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. Simple as that. Because of this understanding, I guess that's why I was typically attracted to the professors who were never overly pedantic and offered a more colloquial approach to academic discourse, something I myself have been attempting to replicate during my over 2 decades in and out of the classroom. Now, the interpretive lens, that I provide in this project is the lens of, yes, a scholar, but also a student, and just some normal dude who really likes to read, cool shit and listen to awesome tunes. Think Bill and Ted, but with a PhD. I love those dudes. So, my friends, let's begin.